So what we've been talking about are the fact that you have, we've been talking about the afferent division, right? The sensory division. We're talking about the different types of sensory receptors. The interoceptors, the exteroceptors, the proprioceptors, right? And so that is information coming into the central nervous system from the periphery, either from outside of your body or from the position of your muscles and joints, or from inside the body, right? Interoceptors inside, exteroceptors outside, proprioceptors, positional information. Now we're going to talk about what your body does, what your nervous system does with that information, how it responds. So now we're going to talk about the efferent or the motor division. Okay? Now, the motor division, or the efferent division of your nervous system is divided into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. You know that already. It was on the previous quiz. You have to remember that the somatic nervous system controls your skeletal muscles. So, the neurons that innervate, that connect to, that communicate with your skeletal muscle cells are called somatic motor neurons. Everything else in your body, adipose tissue, organs, glands, the erector pili muscles in your skin that raise the hair follicles up, all of that stuff is controlled by visceral motor neurons. All of that stuff is part of your autonomic nervous system. So a somatic motor neuron is a motor neuron that innervates a skeletal muscle cell. That's all somatic motor neurons do. They go to skeletal muscles. Visceral motor neurons innervate everything else. And by innervate, I mean go to, right? To connect to. So the skeletal muscles, the cardiac, the heart, the stomach, the intestines, the liver, and all of the endocrine glands, your thyroid gland, your adrenal gland, all that good stuff, all of those things are your effectors because they produce a response. All right. Now, the somatic motor neurons. These are, they're multipolar neurons. And for the most part, they are under voluntary control. We are, for the most part, we are consciously aware of what they do. If you want to walk, if you want to ride, if you want to turn your head, if you want to, whatever. When you're making movements, you are usually aware of those movements. Unless you're asleep, but that's a different story. So we say that these somatic motor neurons are controlled by our consciousness, our voluntary control. Make sense? Now, these somatic motor neurons, they're going out to skeletal muscles. The body, they're multipolar neurons, so they're going to have their soma and their little dendrites. That's going to start either in the spinal cord or in the brain, which we'll talk about, like if you're moving your eyes and things like that, those muscles. But most of them start out in the spinal cord. They all start out in the central nervous system. They start out in the spinal cord, that's where the soma is. And then the axon comes out, the spinal nerve, and goes out to innervate skeletal muscles in the periphery. And so if you look at this, remember we said that sensory information went in the back of the spinal cord, and motor information comes out the front, right? Okay. So what happens is this neuron, it can have, the axon can go two places. It can go out this part, or it can go out that part. Okay. Because this spinal nerve actually branches. We'll talk about those branches a little bit later.
So can it go out both, or does it have to be?
No, it's just going to go out one. Yeah, it's kind of confusing the way they've got it. You'd have one neuron that goes this way, and then another one that goes that way. And what they're doing is the ones that go this way innervate the skeletal muscles in the back of your body. The ones that come out this way, out this branch, innervate pretty much everything else. Your limbs, the what they call the anterolateral, the front and side of your torso, and your limbs. So depending on where the muscles are determines which way it goes out. Does that make sense? But they're all going to skeletal muscles. Spinal cord, this would be the dorsal root, and this would be the ventral root. So a spinal nerve is this little piece right there. You got 31 pairs of those, right? Because you got 31 segments. Talk about that somewhere along the way. Yeah, this is called the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, and this is called the ventral root of the spinal nerve. So basically you have two roots that merge to form the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve's not very long, it's just a little short piece. Okay. All right, so you have to remember, sensory information comes in. Most of your general sensory neurons are unipolar neurons. And since their little cell bodies stick off to the side, that's why you have that ganglion. It's just basically room for those cell bodies, for those cells. Does that make sense? Your multipolar neurons tend to be, your somatic motor neurons are all multipolar neurons. In fact, I think all of your motor neurons are multipolar neurons. But specifically the somatic ones, the ones that control skeletal muscles. And so their somas are inside the spinal cord. And so their axons come out the ventral root. The axons of the sensory, and we'll get to those in a minute, the axons of the sensory neurons come in the dorsal root. The axons of the motor neurons come out the ventral root. So you have the dorsal root and the ventral root. The dorsal root ganglion is where the somas of the unipolar neurons are. Anyways, dorsal root, ventral root, they make the spinal nerve. And then the spinal nerve has three major branches. It has what's called the dorsal branch, the ventral branch, and then these two little branches that come off here, which are called the rami communicantes. Don't panic, we'll get to it in a minute. The word ramus means branch. So you have the ventral root, right? And then you have the ventral ramus. Don't look at it confused. Okay. So this is the ventral root. This is the dorsal root of the spinal nerve. Okay. So the roots merge to form the spinal nerve, and then the spinal nerve immediately branches to form the dorsal ramus, the ventral ramus, and the communicating rami, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so the point being that nervous system is one of those things that's hard to talk about one part without talking about everything. The somatic motor neurons that are controlling what?
Your movement.
Well, yeah, so they're innervating skeletal muscles, okay? They start out here. They're somas, they're multipolar neurons. Their somas start here. Their axons come out the ventral root of the spinal nerve. And then they continue either through the dorsal ramus to the skeletal muscles in the back, or the ventral ramus to all the other skeletal muscles, side, front, yams. All right, now the visceral motor neurons, the ones that control everything except the skeletal muscles, part of your autonomic nervous system. These we are not usually aware of. These are under involuntary control. We can't say erector pili muscles, stand up. You know, we can't say stomach churn. We can't say heart slow down. These things, this is lots and lots of motor information going out from your brain and spinal cord, but we are not in control of it. We consider it involuntary. All right. Now, those motor neurons are going to start at the same place. They're going to start in the spinal cord, for example. They're in a little bit different. They're in what's called the lateral horns, the lateral great horns. We'll talk about what that is in a minute. But the somas, they're still multipolar. The somas are still inside the spinal cord. The axons still come out that ventral root. This one comes out, and it innervates with a second visceral motor neuron. So your somatic motor neurons start in the spinal cord, and they go out directly to a skeletal muscle cell. Okay? Visceral motor neurons, there's two neurons in the pathway. You have the one that starts in the spinal cord, and then it connects with or synapses with a second visceral motor neuron. Your somatic motor pathways, I guess is what you would call it, your somatic motor pathways. You've got one motor neuron that starts in here, right? It comes out of the spinal cord, and it synapses with a skeletal muscle cell. Okay? Visceral is strange. Visceral, the first motor neuron starts in here. It synapses with a second visceral motor neuron. And then that motor neuron synapses with whatever the effector is. Heart, glands, fat cell, whatever. Okay? All right, so in this diagram, this visceral motor neuron starts out in the spinal cord. The axon comes out what? What's this called?
The
Ventral root. Okay. And then it enters what's called the rami communicantes. The communicating rami. Not the dorsal ramus, not the ventral ramus, but the rami communicantes. The communicating ramus. Rami. Okay. And then it can synapse with the second visceral motor neuron in what's called an autonomic ganglion. That's what this is. And these autonomic ganglia, some of them are really close to the spinal cord. Some of them are practically in the effector, all the way out here. And we'll talk about the difference later. I'm just trying to get the fundamental architecture in your brain before I fill in the details. Does that make sense? All right, now, it's the second visceral motor neuron, VMN, visceral motor neuron, right? Its soma is going to be in the autonomic ganglia, and then its axons can go several different places. Visceral motor neuron starts in the spinal cord, synapses with a second visceral motor neuron in some ganglia somewhere, right? Second visceral motor neuron can go several places. It can go out, come back to the spinal nerve, and go out the dorsal ramus to smooth muscles of the back. So anything basically coming out the dorsal ramus is going to some kind of effector in the back, right? If it is the axon of a somatic motor neuron, it's going to skeletal muscles in the back. If it is the axon of the second visceral motor neuron, it's going to smooth muscles in the back. What kind of smooth muscles have I got in the back? Think about that skin covering your back.
Is that a muscle?
No, it's not, but there are muscles in the skin. What are they called? Retroculi muscles. Think about all the blood vessels that are inside the muscles and the dermis. Those blood vessels have smooth muscles in their wall. Okay? So we normally think about skeletal muscle, skin, but you got to remember all the little things that are inside all of those things. Blood vessels that are back there. Retroculi muscles. Does that make sense? So those things have to know whether to contract or relax. The smooth muscles, we're not consciously aware of that. We're not in control of that. But you still need information. You still need motor information to those structures. Make sense? All right, so this second, the black one here, the second visceral motor neuron, it can innervate smooth muscles in the back. Skin, blood vessels, those kind of things. It can come out what ramus is this? Ventral ramus. And so it can innervate smooth muscles and glands basically every place else. So this would be this blood vessels, smooth muscles in the blood vessels, smooth muscles in the skin, adipose tissue, sweat glands, those kind of structures. Okay? Or it can send an axon out what's called a sympathetic nerve. So it can send an axon back this way, and then that axon can either go out here or out here. Or it can send an axon out, instead of going back to the spinal nerve, it goes out the other way. Sympathetic nerves. And this is going to innervate smooth muscles and glands in the guts, your visceral organs, your thoracic and abdominal organs. So, if it is an axon of a motor neuron coming out of the dorsal ramus, it's going to something in the back. If it is a visceral motor neuron, it's going to smooth muscles in the back.
Everywhere.
Well, if it's at the dorsal ramus, it's going to smooth muscles in the back. If it is a somatic motor neuron that comes out the dorsal ramus, that goes to what? Skeletal muscle cells. See the difference? They're both going out the dorsal ramus. They're going to structures in the back. It's just different structures. Same thing with the ventral ramus. They're going to structures in the limbs and basically the side and the front of the body wall. If it's visceral motor, they're going to smooth muscles and glands. If it's somatic motor, it's going to skeletal muscles. But the guts, your organs, that visceral motor neuron axon doesn't go back here to go here, it goes out this way. See that? Let me give you some another vocabulary lesson. This neuron, the first visceral motor neuron, is going to synapse with the second visceral motor neuron in a ganglion somewhere, right? So this would be my ganglion, my autonomic ganglion. Right? Some of these are close to the spinal cord, some of them are down near the organs. This neuron is called a pre-ganglionic neuron. The first one. Because it's going to the ganglion. This neuron is called a, no, I know, that's what you would think. This neuron is called a ganglionic neuron. Because it starts in the ganglion.
So you would never call it a post?
Wait a minute, hang on. Hang on. The axon is called a post-ganglionic axon.
Everything's so long. Wow.
So that thing is a whole, is a ganglionic neuron.
Ganglionic neuron because it starts in the ganglion.
That
Okay.
includes the cell
But
body,
just the axon
axons,
is
and
just-
dendrites.
Just the axon is called a post because it's leaving the ganglion.
So is that a preganglionic axon?
Yes.
They better be.
So you have to be careful, am I talking about the entire neuron, or am I talking just about the axon? The preganglionic neuron starts in the central nervous system. The preganglionic neuron synapses with a ganglionic neuron that starts in a ganglion. Okay? The preganglionic neuron sends out a preganglionic axon to the ganglion. The ganglionic neuron sends out a postganglionic axon to the effector. All right, so we've talked about the efferent vision, we talked about the afferent vision, then we're going to get to the interneurons. These are the neurons that are in the brain, in the spinal cord, and you can have some here. Not necessarily, but you can have some here as well. Interneurons basically are going to be found between sensory neurons and motor neurons. But an interneuron is basically any neuron that's in between two other neurons. These are the neurons in your brain, in your spinal cord, and in some of your autonomic ganglia. You can think about the interneurons as the thinking part of your brain, the processing part, the integration part, the stuff that gets the sensory information and decides what to do about it. Somewhere your consciousness exists, somewhere in a bunch of interneurons. We don't know where exactly yet. So the simplest interneuron is something that's in a somatic reflex arc. You step on a tack, the sensory motor neuron comes in, synapses with an interneuron, which synapses with a somatic motor neuron going out. Make sense? That's the interneuron. And so you can see the entire interneuron is in the spinal cord. So the more complex a response, the more interneurons that are involved. If you step on a tack, I think we talked about the cross extension reflex, you're going to pick that foot up. At the same time, you're going to send signals to this side of your body to make sure you don't fall over. Does that make sense? So that involves a whole lot of interneurons. You know, you got to figure out, you got to get information from here to over here, and then you got to send some information to brain so you can explain why you're doing this. So that's a lot of interneurons. If you touch something hot and pull it back, that's not as complex. Unless I'm really drunk, this is not going to cause me to fall. Right?
But
See what I'm saying? But this might.
isn't there like there's a delay in there?
There is a delay.
But it's so fast of a delay that you don't notice.
Well, you will realize that you pulled your arm back before you feel the pain. Because you can have what's called a monosynaptic reflex, where this sensory neuron directly synapses on the motor neuron. And so you've just got a couple of milliseconds maybe. Whereas if the sensory neuron synapses on a interneuron, which is going to send a signal to your thalamus, which is going to synapse on another neuron to send a signal to your cerebral cortex, the reason that you perceive the pain second is because you've got more synapses. So every place you've got a synapse, you get a bit of a delay. Polysynaptic reflex arcs take longer than monosynaptic reflex arcs. Exteroceptors and proprioceptors those are going to be your somatic sensory neurons. They're going to bring information through the peripheral nervous system into the central nervous system, into interneurons that are going to be in the brain or spinal cord. Okay? Your interoreceptors, that's the information from your guts. That's going to come in via the autonomic nervous system, sensory information. And that's also going to synapse on the interneurons. The problem is, some of this information is going to go on up to our cerebral cortex that we're aware of it. This information, unless it's really, really strong, is not. But the exteroceptors and the proprioceptors send in sensory information via sensory neurons into the central nervous system, the brain or spinal cord. That information goes out, or this information, the interneurons process it, they send out motor information out to your skeletal muscle fibers via your somatic motor neurons. Okay? That's the part of our nervous system we're aware of. The part that we're not aware of, the interoceptors come in. You still have visceral sensory receptors. They send information into the central nervous system. That information is sent out via visceral motor neurons, and that's where you get the preganglionic fiber. Fiber refers to axon, which synapses with a second visceral motor neuron in a ganglia somewhere. And then you get the postganglionic axon or postganglionic fiber out to the effector.